Good afternoon, everybody, or evening, or morning. I know we've got our Australia friends, or it's very early in the morning, so thank you for being here. And Macau, we have somebody from Macau. That's a new country for us. I'm very excited about that. So thank you, everybody, for being here. I know there's some people still logging in, but we're going to go ahead and get started. So what we're doing today is everything I'm showing you today is a result of people answering my blog post that asked what you want to learn in our webinars. So all of these things I'm showing you today were requests by some of my readers. So thank you all who replied. And by the way, speaking of requests, if you haven't yet in today's blog, and it was also on Sunday and I think Thursday, there is a link to a survey which asks questions that of things you like in the blog and my store, courses, workshops, a little bit of everything, just to get some feedback on what you like, what you'd like to see. Because sometimes it's hard sitting here going, okay, what's everybody going to want next? So I definitely appreciate everybody who's already done it. It was over 60 when I looked just a little while ago. If you could take about 10 minutes, if you could do that for me, I would greatly appreciate it, and that will be open until Sunday night. Alrighty, with that, somebody has a black screen. I would log out and log in again, Abby. I don't know why. You should be seeing my desktop. It has to be something in the Zoom connection, so I would try signing off of Zoom and then click the link again and try and log back in. If you do have questions as I go along, as usual, feel free to type them in the chat box. If you could please choose under 2 above where you type, choose everyone so that everybody can see the questions so that they know what the heck I'm talking about when I start to answer it. I would greatly appreciate that. And so with that, let me close this little guy. And thanks to everybody who already purchased the notes. And if you haven't, those will be on sale till next Tuesday for $5 with the images that I'm going to use today. And there's a set of 6 textures in there since I'm not really using textures today, but I wanted to make sure you have a little extra goodies in your purchase. All right, so this first image, we're going to start with just kind of a review of adjustment layers and a little bit of masking. And why I do things on separate layers and why that's a good practice to get into. I know the alternative is using smart objects, just never became part of my workflow, but if you already do that, then keep doing that. That is a definite good way to do things, but we're not going to cover that today. We're going to cover layers. So this image is a raw file. And I just opened it and saved it as a TIFF to make it a smaller file for including with the notes. So that's all I did with this, was just save it as a TIFF. So the first thing I always do when I start working on any image is I duplicate my background layer. And on a PC, Dave is laughing at me. On a PC, that's Control-J. On a Mac, that'd be Command-J, or you can drag it down to the new layer icon. There's like 4 different ways you can duplicate a layer. So whatever way you like to do is fine. So this is based on you doing a full edit here in Photoshop and not starting in Lightroom. Quite often I'll do my basic adjustments in Lightroom, but I'm just going to show you today Photoshop and how you can do a full edit here. So if you don't already have like your adjustment panel docked over here and you need to get to that, that's under your window and you would go to adjustments and it would pop up as a freestanding panel, but I like to have mine docked here because I use it all the time. And the first thing we're going to do is a levels adjustment, and that's the one that looks like your histogram. So by doing it on a separate layer, you'll see that the adjustment automatically adds a layer here, and it even adds a layer mask, which we'll get to in a little while. So the first thing under here, this is just like the histogram in your camera. And you want to adjust your black point, which is on the left, and your white point, which is on the right. And you want to generally bring these triangles to the beginning of the mountain here, if you want to call it that. For this particular setting, I left this side at 0 because it really is in a really perfect spot there. It's not running up the side, so I don't have any blacked in shadows. The right side, I'm going to move over just a little bit to the beginning of that, to about 244. And then the center controls your midtones, and I don't usually move this much. I did move it just a little bit for this one. I wanted to go to like 105, just brighten it up a little bit in the midtones. So the advantage of doing your adjustments with adjustment layers, rather than going to, you could go to image and adjustments and you'll see the same settings. If you do them here, they're changing the pixels of your layer. By doing it on a separate adjustment layer, it becomes non-destructive, so you're not changing the pixels of your layer. Plus, if I want to go back and make changes, say I do 2 or 3 more things, I can just double click on this little icon and reopen that. You can't do that if you've done it through here, because then it becomes part of that layer. So that's the advantage, is you can come back and change things at any point. So the next thing that we want to do is, and there's usually these 3 adjustment layers that we're doing are kind of like the basics if you're working on an unedited photo. So first, always do levels, because if that's not right, then it's going to be hard to adjust color and contrast. So next, I'm going to do a brightness and contrast. Same thing, it automatically adds a layer. And pretty much every image needs a little bit of contrast, especially on a raw file. You get that very flat looking. So for this one, I moved my brightness to 11 and my contrast to 17. Somebody said, Charles says, when do you not do the adjustments as a layer? I always do these particular adjustments as a layer, an adjustment layer. I never select up here. The only one I use from up top here under adjustments is if I'm using shadows and highlights, because that needs the pixels to be able to see the adjustment. So that's why I duplicate my layer, because then I'll come back to this layer and I can do my shadows and highlights after I've done my other things. So that's the only one I'll do that way. So we've got our brightness and contrast, and then the third one is hue and saturation. I only change the hue generally if I need to do like color correcting. You know, you shot indoors and you've got kind of funky lighting and that type of thing, is when I'll change hue. So usually I don't do that too much. Here I'm just going to add just the tiniest bit of saturation. I'm only going to go to 4 because this is fairly well saturated. And again, because we have separate layers, I can always come back later on and tweak that further if I need to. Question, what's the difference between the brightness here and midtone brightness and levels? This is an overall brightening. When you do the brightness adjustment here, this is brightening the entire image, where the mid one on the levels is only controlling the midtones of the image. So this is an overall brightness here. That would be the difference there. So next I want to crop my image a little bit and straighten it just a hair. For me, it seems like they're kind of going downhill a little, even though it's probably just the way it really was. I'm going to adjust that. So just click on that layer. So I'm on the top. I'm going to click on my crop tool. And you can either use the straighten tool, and if you click that, the way you do it is you would click on one side, keep holding the left mouse button down, drag it to what you want to straighten, and when you let go, it will straighten it. The other way you can do that is if you put your cursor outside of the cropped box and you get that curved arrow. Once I click with my left mouse button, it gives me a finer grid, and then I can just angle it the way I want. And sometimes I find that easier to do. So that's my straighten. And then I decided to crop. Where did I crop? I'm looking at my finished one on the other screen. I don't think I really cropped too much more than that. I kind of like it the way it is. Could maybe come down on top just a little bit. Whoops. And so you'll see what happened here when I started to drag it. It was constraining my proportions. And that's because I had a size in here from something I was doing earlier. So I'm going to clear that. And we're going to get to sizing later on, so we'll talk about that some more. But I just want to draw this down without cropping the left and right. And then I'll hit the check mark to accept that. And the other thing, too, I wanted to point out, let me click back on the crop tool again. You'll notice up here on top where it has delete cropped pixels. If you want to be able to access those outside pixels later and maybe change your mind, don't check that box. The reason that I usually do is because if I'm going to use Topaz or some of the other software, it does not recognize a Photoshop crop. So even though I've cropped it, if I open up Topaz Studio, it's going to see the entire image, even if the pixels are just hidden. So but if you do that, then they don't. So that's the reason that I have that way. Okay, so instead of using Photoshop's sharpening tools, I prefer Topaz AI Clear in Studio 2. So again, this is, many of you probably heard me talk about it before. They're no longer actively selling the product, but I like it. I have it and I love it. And so I'm going to go to my filter and actually, all right, where are you now? Showing me that. Why is it grayed out? Well, that's weird. Let's get off the crop tool, maybe. Alrighty then. So this is, again, sometimes I mentioned making a merged layer, which, that's right, that's what I need to do, because with Topaz and with Luminar, they cannot read this whole file. They can only read this top layer, and there are no pixels on that layer. So that's why the filters are grayed out. So I don't want to delete these layers in case I want to go back to them. So I'm going to create a merged layer, which merges these and adds it as a separate layer on top. And the keyboard shortcut for this is Control, Alt, Shift, and the letter E. And that is in the notes. On a Mac, it would be Command, Option, Shift, E. So now I have my merged layer, and I always rename this so that I remember that it's a merged layer. And then I'm going to duplicate that layer. So if I do something here, especially if I'm doing creative stuff and I don't like it, it's easy to just delete this layer, and then I already still have my merged copy here. So good question. Sandy says, how do you unmerge it if you wanted to go back now and change things down here? You can't. You can't unmerge it. You would have to delete these layers to go back and further adjust those. And again, that's only because I'm using Topaz. If I were just working in Photoshop, then I wouldn't have needed to create this layer if I did Photoshop sharpening. I just don't really like unsharp mask, and I find it easier to do the Topaz AI Clear. So again, a lot of this is always personal preference. So I'm just showing you how I do things. And as you know, there's tons and tons of tutorials out there. You can always search for a particular subject and find out how somebody else does it, because there's always 10 ways to do things in Photoshop, as we know. So I'm just adding a filter. I'm adding the AI Clear. I rarely change any of these settings. And what AI Clear does is add denoise, clarity, and detail all at the same time. And it's smart enough to know what areas to apply which to. Studio, it's buried on the Topaz website. They are no longer updating it, is the problem. So I kind of advise people to not buy it. It is like $99, so it's not hugely expensive, but there's going to come a time with, between Windows and Mac updating their operating systems and, Photoshop keep getting updating that it's eventually not going to work. Although even the older Studio is still working for me. I'm on Windows 10. I have not done Windows 11, and I really don't need to right now. So that's it's there, but I would suggest checking out Luminar instead. Luminar Neo. You can do all of these same things. It's just kind of a one-click thing here in Topaz, but you can do structure and detail and denoise in Luminar as well. In fact, watch the blog probably on Thursday, because Luminar is adding some more stuff to their program. Okay, let's see, we have a couple other questions. For elements, what's the difference between unsharp mask and adjust sharpness? Good question. Unsharp mask is the traditional sharpening feature. I actually, years ago, when I was still using elements, and you can do this in Photoshop too, I started using the high pass filter, and somebody else I just mentioned that. That would be my alternative if I wanted to sharpen in Photoshop, is to do the high pass filter. And now that somebody mentioned it, I'm going to do a quick tutorial on that for Thursday's blog. Making myself a note so I don't forget. Because I used to use that all the time, and I like that much, much better than sharpening. It's easier to see what you really want. Yes, and Judith says Luminar also supports the Ukrainian software team. They are based in the Ukraine, and they're doing a fabulous job considering what they've been going through for the past 6 months. And Charles says, is the clear in AI denoise not as good? Denoise AI is a good program. It's just that it's separate, where here I kind of can do them all together. If I have an exceptionally noisy image, I will use the denoise AI, and there is Sharpen AI as well from Topaz. Those are actually their current products are Sharpen AI, denoise AI, and Gigapixel AI for enlarging small images to really large sizes. So I do use the denoise when I have an exceptionally noisy image, like something that was done at night or indoors, and I really had to crank up the ISO. Those work great for that. Okay, so let's get back to here. So I've done this, and the other thing that I sometimes do here, if I want to add just a little more detail, is there is a precision detail filter. And I'll usually adjust just the overall small detail and medium detail a little bit. Usually between 10 and 20 is sufficient. You don't want to get too overly crunchy. And then I'll just click accept to go back. So now what I want to do is I've applied these Topaz adjustments, right? And I'm going to rename this so we know what we did here. AI clear and precision detail. I don't want to add more detail to my background. I want it on my subject, right? So this is where masking comes into play. So I'm going to add a layer mask. Let's see, let me see where I am in my notes. Actually, before I add the layer mask, I want a quicker way to do this. We could add a layer mask and mask it away, but in, I don't know, a couple of versions ago in Photoshop CC, under the quick selection tool, we now have a select subject button. So this can kind of give you a quicker, easier way to do some masking with using the select subjects. So it sort of did a good job. It didn't do as good as it did the other day. I'm trying to find my cursor. Where'd it go? It's up there. Okay, so I'm going to make my brush a little bigger so you can see it. So it only selected part of the deer. So I'm going to click here and I'm going to add some more to this selection. And I can always adjust it, so I'm not worried about being too precise. I just want the sharpening to end up being in this area and not on the grass in the background. So now that I have a selection, now I'm going to click my Add a Layer Mask button. And it automatically masks the background. So anything that's black means what I did on this layer is not visible. So let's see if I can zoom in so you can kind of see it a little better. So if I turn that layer off, actually if I hide this mask, so let's disable the mask. So you can see it's gotten sharpening and detail in the grasses. And then when I turn that off, it got softer again. So that's what we wanted to do there. We want to keep that background softer. So let's click to the next page here. I'm trying to read my notes. So I decided after doing that I wanted a little bit of the sharpening down on the bottom, but not all of it. So the way masking works is, the mantra to remember is black hides, white reveals. So black is hiding that effect, right? The white, where the deer is where the effect is revealed, what we did on that layer. So if I take a soft brush, let's get back to my soft round brush, and well, I want it big, but not quite that big. I was doing texture brushes earlier the other day. So I want it to be big enough that I can kind of go one swipe across the bottom here. And because it's soft, it's okay if it overlaps a little bit. But what I want to do, rather than painting with white, because that would let all of it show through, I'm going to make this 50% gray, which is the number 828282. And you'll see it's right over here at 50% gray. Or you can just click over here. What's that, dear? Yes. So I'm just going to say, okay. So now my, excuse me, losing my voice. I'm going to start way off the edge. I'm going to come back just so I can see it. And I'm going to click and just draw in one stroke right across. And when I let go, you can see it's now gray down here. So that's letting some of that sharpening come through. And that's all I really needed for this image at this point. I could tweak a little bit more, but as a basic overview of layers, that's what you need to do. Debbie says Topaz is coming out with AI photos. Yes, it's going to combine the Denoise AI sharpening and gigapixel into one. I have the beta version of that. A couple people mentioned that. Thank you. And I think I got everybody covered for that one. Okay, so let's close this one because I already have it saved. And the next one I want to show you selection tool. We just used our selection tool a little bit, but here's another way that you might want to use selections and something to think about when you're selecting. So for this project, I wanted to select this butterfly to put it into a composite. And I'll show you the finished composite I used it in. We're not going to go into all the steps because I don't have time today, but I think I've done that one already. Myra says if you already own those two, if you own all three, gigapixel, sharpen, and denoise, I believe it's going to be a free upgrade. I believe that's what I've seen. Don't quote me on it, but you never know what they might change. And if it's not free, I'm sure it will be a very inexpensive upgrade. If you don't own any of them, then it will be a one pricing. They haven't announced any pricing yet that I've seen, at least not to us affiliates. So I'm going to click on that, wrong one, quick selection tool again that we just used. And might as well start with the select a subject and see what it can do. Most of the time it does a pretty good job, I must say, of finding what would be the main selection. And you can see it did do a really good job here selecting the butterfly. Might have to tweak a little bit where that red is between the things here. It did select a little too much over here. So you'll see inside of my cursor is a plus sign. So if I click something else, it's going to automatically add that to my selection. If I want to take away from the selection, I can either change the commands up here, but I find it easier to just hold down the Alt or Option on a Mac key, and you can see now it's a minus sign, and then I can just click to take away whatever it selected that I don't need. And then down here, I would make my brush very small and really zoom in and do the same thing. And when you use this brush, you don't have to be precise. It does a pretty good job usually of finding edges. So I'm going to select a little more and then come back and try and refine that a little to grab that. And you would do it, obviously take a lot more time. So before I try and select the antenna, what I wanted to show you was, because especially with this one, we have such a bright color around the edges. If I just selected this and put it on a separate layer, which I'm going to do, I'm just going to do a quick Control J, and that will put this on a separate layer with a transparent background. You can kind of see some of the reddish tones around the edges of this. So what we're going to do is, before, whoops, let's go back and reselect that. Select. Pooh. Let's do undo that. There we go. Before I make that a separate layer and then select these, I'm going to go into Select, Modify, and contract my selection. So I want to bring it in from that edge, just like a pixel or two. Okay. And then when I say OK, you're going to see that dotted line move a little bit. See how it came in just a little? So that way you make sure that you're not catching any of those excess pixels. Now, the reason I did that before I selected the antenna, because if I did it after, it would probably make the antenna disappear because they're so narrow. So now I'm just going to show you this quickly. I have one that's already completed because it takes a little time when you're working with something this narrow. But I'm just would draw my cursor in like little short strokes, and you can see it does a pretty good job of selecting those. It's just takes some time. So I'm going to show you the finished one because I want to cover a lot today. So you can see I did a nice selection here, and I know I spent a lot of time on this, and I really should probably take out that red in there. And this is how I used that image. And this is a composite project with a whole bunch of layers and brushes and things. And I may have done this in a previous webinar, I'm not sure. If not, I will put that into something in the future. Good question, Chris. How are you adjusting the brush size? I'm using my bracket keys, the square bracket keys, which are to the right of the letter P on your keyboard. The left square one will make it smaller, and the right one will make it bigger. That's a great question. It's a lot easier than if you're on the brush and then having to, go up and change the size from the sliders. It's like, I don't know how big 66 pixels is until I get the brush over here. Nope, that's not big enough. So instead of going back and forth, I can just hit my bracket key and it will make the brush bigger and smaller. Okay, so I'm clicking on things I shouldn't be. That's why I'm getting weird errors there. So let's close all these. We won't save that. So another way that you might use selections and also layer masks, I'm going to open up another image. So what I wanted to do here was turn my background black and white and leave the butterfly, excuse me, let me get some water, leave the butterfly in color. And this is something, some people say it's kind of an outdated thing. You'll see people do it like with weddings and everything's black and white, but maybe the flowers or something like that. So that would be, it's a personal thing. So this one we definitely need 2 layers for. So I'm going to do a Control or Command J to copy that. Sandy says, what do I use to get the selection onto a layer? On a Mac, it would be Command J. just like in the beginning, like now we're duplicating the layer with a Control Command J. When you have a selection made, it will only copy the selection to a separate layer. I should have mentioned that. So, but if you do it when you don't have a selection, then it copies the whole layer. So what I want to do here is select my butterfly. So I'm going to use this again. I think this is a great handy tool to kind of speed up the whole selection process. And again, it did a pretty good job of selecting everything. So for this one, what I want to do is to add a black and white adjustment layer. So actually, let me unselect this for a second. So before I do that, sorry, I'm going to add a black and white adjustment layer. And you can fine tune things. So because I only am going to end up with the background in black and white, I'm just going to adjust the brightnesses of the colors for the background and not worry about what it's doing to the butterfly. So you can just like tweak those, say okay. And now I actually want to go back and do that selection because I'm going to add that to this mask. So you can, well, you know what? I'm going to show you the other way to do it. I take that back. We're not going to use the selection tool. We're going to actually paint this one. So we're going to stay with it. We're going to grab our brush, sorry, soft round brush. Actually, I want to make it harder because I've got straight edges on the edge here. So let's just make the hardness 100%. And I want to make my foreground color black because remember, whatever I hide is going to let the layer that's below it show through. It's going to hide this black and white effect. And then as I paint, it's going to let what's underneath show up. So you can see where it's black, you can see the color. So here's a trick. When you're going along an edge and you want to draw a straight line, if you click at the beginning of the line, then after you click, hold the Shift key and click the end of the line, it will join those 2 points. So it's a great way to draw a straight line, and this works with any brush tool or any tool. I mean, the butterfly is already kind of black and white up there. And the reason that we do masking and not erasing, erasing would damage the pixels, basically. If I make a mistake and I've painted outside the lines, change your foreground color to white, and then you can paint the white back in. So you can fix your mistakes much easier by using masking. And then if you hit the, if you have black and white as your defaults here, just hit the X key and it will flip it back. So it makes it a quick way to change your colors between the foreground and background when you're doing this kind of work. I keep my left hand on the X and my right hand on my mouse, and there you have it. Any questions on that one? I think we're good. It's a pretty, simple process. Sometimes these things, if you haven't done them before, you just have to kind of think about it a little. Like, all right, I want to do this, and what would be the easiest way to get there? So that's what I'm trying to just give you some ideas so that you have some of these things in mind as you work on different projects. So let's close that one. So next, somebody asked me to show the liquify filter. And to be honest, I haven't really used this much, so I had to test it myself for this project. So this flower, even though it looks a little bit liquefied, this was one I did way back in a webinar, and I created this with Smart Photo Editor. So that's why it has this pretty cool background on it. So next we are going to duplicate our background layer, Control J. Let's see, how do you combine the layers when done? We're going to get to that in a second, Erin. Or M, sorry. And Glenda says, when you talk about Luminar, will you address and make more clear their new subscription model? Yes. Will those who already own Neo be able to switch with some kind of discount, or is it advisable to wait till Neo is old and then enroll in SX. I will definitely go over that because it is a little confusing that you have the option of either purchasing the software outright or doing a monthly subscription. And they have some new extensions that they're adding to it. The first one out is for HDR. And I'll get into that. I'll be doing a webinar on that soon too, I'm sure. Smart Photo Editor is another little plugin program. If you go back to my YouTube channel, there is a webinar that I use that in. I think I did a whole one on that. Or send me an email, Gary, and I can tell you which one it's in, but I know I've covered some of that before. Thank you, Abby. I like this one too. So what I decided to try here was to go, this filter is under the filter menu, and it's up here called liquify. And what this does is let you basically paint or stretch pixels with this filter. So there's lots of different things you can do here. You can start dragging pixels, okay, just by taking, I'm on the brush tool. Let's see, I think I need to go to, yep, the top one, forward warp tool, and it will just let me start dragging things. So I decided I wanted to get rid of the background and just stretch a bunch of the petals out, and I'll show you the one I finished because it does take a little bit of time. And then I'm going to show you another image, and we're going to do some of the things that they have for shaping people. You can adjust eyes and nose and mouth and face shape and even a little bit of body shape. So there's some cool things you can do. So there are some different settings here. So we have a reconstruct tool if you want to kind of undo things. A smooth tool, I really didn't use that one too much. There is a pucker tool, which is kind of neat if you want to make something, see how it's like changing it differently. It's puckering it in the middle. It's kind of a unusual tool, but as you move it, you can see it's changing it without necessarily drawing it. It's kind of mushing it together. And then you have a bloat tool, which does the opposite. Well, the longer you hold down the mouse button, you can see the more that it's stretching it. Push left and push right, so it would only go one direction. There's some really cool things in here, and I only did these couple of projects with it. So Darcy said, the pucker tool helps me to lose 10 pounds very quickly. I'm going to show you my finished version. So let's get out of here for a second. So this was the first one that I did. And that was all done just by stretching all these things out all the way around. And then I tried a second version that I started on. I did not finish this one yet. And there is the original. And I kind of liked, this look over here in the upper right that the other software did to it. And I started trying to replicate it. I don't think it's the most successful thing, but you can, go in, let's duplicate that layer again, and go back to the filter, liquify. There's one other thing I wanted to show you. There is a freeze mask tool. So when you're doing something like this, say I want to make sure that the center petals don't get stretched. So you can mask it, and this red isn't going to show up. This is just letting you know what areas you're freezing. So these petals won't change at all, and you only really have to do the edges. So if I then go back to my tool here, when I start pulling, it's not moving anything underneath. Even if I go right up over that red edge, it's only pulling from whatever was on the outside of that. So that's how that would work. So that's kind of how I was playing there. So let's do the portrait. This is the liquify filter or tool. I'll show you again in a second. It's under, this is Photoshop, under Filter, Liquify is what I'm using for that. So let's close these guys and I'll open the portrait. Close all. No, no. Okay. So on this one, and you could be very subtle or more dramatic. So I'm going to put these up side by side and see if you can see the difference first. And then I'll tell you kind of what I did here. So let's move that one over here. And try and make them about the same size. So if you look really closely, I made her eyes slightly larger. I changed her eyebrow a little bit by nudging down. I changed her jawline to be a little narrower. And then I smoothed out some of the bumps on her jacket on both sides. I did that a little bit. And oh, and I also made her lips slightly fuller and made a little bit more of a smile. So like I said, they're very subtle, and I'll show you these. How are we doing on time? We're quarter of. That's good. So let's duplicate that and go to our filter and liquify. And I did not write down all these settings in the notes because it's really something you need to just get in there and try. So I'm going to, so you've got eyes, you've got your left and your right. So you can use the sliders to, you can see her eye changing. I'm kind of going, okay, see how it's enlarging the whole thing? And then you would want to do the same most likely to the other eye, even though that would be, you know, because of the angle of her face, you won't notice it as much. And then you can change the height of the eyes. You can see how that's working. You can change the width of the eyes. So you can give somebody really large eyes if you really wanted to. So let's see if we can, let's zero those two out. And then you can also tilt their eye. It's kind of funky, but you can do that kind of stuff. And then the nose, you can change the height and the width of their nose. So if you want to make their nose a little narrower, you can do that. You can see the difference here. Yeah, you got to be careful when you do some of these, because if you go too far, then you start distorting other parts. We can make her upper lip a little fuller. Make that a little bigger. Make the lower lip bigger or smaller. The width of the mouth as well. You can see it's changing. You can add a little more smile. You can you can go a little crazy. Mouth height changes there as well. So you can give her some really full lips if you want. You can also change the forehead, the jawline. So that's where I did that. So it really, you can slim down somebody's face. And then like for the jacket, I just used that same tool I was using on the flower and made it smaller. And just very little bit, you can nudge things around like that. So let me zoom in so you can see where I did that one. Let's say we wanted to slim this down a little bit, so you can just push that part up, and then if you go Control Z or Command Z will undo, just like in Photoshop. But you can, you know, kind of play around with that. What's the difference between the liquify and the smudge tool? I think the liquify is a little more dramatic. I do use the smudge tool, and you've seen me do it like when I have a small area near the edge of like a background and I want to just kind of blend it out instead of using the clone tool. This is a little more dramatic than yeah, and there's a lot more options. So you can freeze things where you have to be careful of that when you're using the smudge tool. So there you go. So we've kind of made her look a little bit different. Well, that's the way she was looking. I didn't really change that. I only changed the size. So, oh, and then for the eyebrows, I used the same one, and I just kind of did a little, got rid of the little bit of the high arch she had there on that. So you can, and this is what they do to models in magazines, right? So I'm going to cancel that one. So that's that part. So then we're going to talk about merging and flattening layers and then sizing for printing. So I'm going to reopen. Oh, I think I'm opening the wrong one. Yeah, that one's already flattened. Go back to our layered file. So here's my finished TIFF file for the deer that we did in the beginning. So you can see I've got all my layers here. So, so again, and we did that here, if you wanted to create that merged layer to use a plugin on it, it's the Control-Alt-Shift-E or Option-Command-Shift-E on a Mac. And that combines 2 or more layers without flattening it. It gives you that new layer without flattening things. So somebody asked me, what's the difference in, why do you save a TIFF and then save it as a JPEG? I always save my images as a TIFF first, so I might look at this tomorrow and go, yeah, I should have, changed this or done that or changed my colors or whatever. I can come back to this layered file. So I always keep, and I prefer TIFF over PSD because the TIFF is a more universal file format, where a PSD is proprietary to Adobe and it may not work in all other programs. So I save it as a TIFF, and then if say I want to put this on Facebook, then I will go in and go layer flatten. If I'm putting it on social media, I will add my watermark. So I'll go File, Open, and I keep it on my desktop. Makes it easier to find it. And I use the smaller one. And then using the Move tool, just like bringing in a texture, I will, you pull down, separate the two, click and drag my logo over, and then I can move it and size it. And if you want to move something just a pixel at a time, if you use your arrow keys, the up, down, left, right, you can see it's just moving it a little bit. And then I also usually will lower the opacity of my watermark to around 80%, depending on the color that it's on. It's like I want it to be there, but I, don't need it to be in the face. And then I'll resize it. Yeah, I'll get to that question in a minute. I'm going to resize this. And I usually do somewhere around a 4:6, whatever that comes out to be. I'll make the longest side a 6. And you can make it a lower DPI. I usually don't. And then I will do a file save as, because I don't want to save over anything else. So I would name this now. I do it, I put web, that way I know it's size smaller and it's also got my watermark, and then save it as a JPEG. Let's see, okay. And so what if I had done some work and wanted to remove some of the grass off the nose? You could come back because we still have that TIFF file. So let me go back to the TIFF file. No. Even though I've done other stuff, I could go back and I could still work on that and clone that out. You could definitely do that after. What's that, dear? Oh, that's the wrong file. That was my original. Sorry. Let me open the finished one. There we go. So what I would do in this case, because I've done a bunch of things, I would probably create another merged layer. That would be my preference. And again, just select the top layer, then do the Control-Alt-Shift-E And now I would label this cloning so I know, what I was doing. You could be more descriptive. And then I would go in and, either use the healing brush or the clone tool and work on that. Shruti said, I saw the use of the puppet warp tool to swirl adjust flowers. It really worked well. It allowed you to set pins to avoid distorting the image. Yes, there are other things in there. And as much as, I know Photoshop fairly well, I am by no means an expert. And there are some things that you just don't always get around to using. So there are some tools, like I said, even the liquify I really hadn't used before. I just never really had a need for it. So definitely, explore some of those other tools. What resolution to use for the web? I usually leave it at 300, but a lot of people like to make it 72 DPI. Just, somebody's going to steal it. It's going to be a low res. It doesn't really, these days, with things like Topaz Gigapixel and other programs, if they really want it, they can blow it up from whatever. So I usually just leave it at the 300 that I always work at. Say I want to add 2 textures to a flower. If I want to keep the center of the flower in focus, so mask the first texture. I want the same area in focus for the second texture. Can you duplicate a mask layer? Yes, you absolutely can. And that's a great question. And I know I've done that before. So say we want this same mask on this layer. We did something up here and we want to duplicate it. All you do is click the mask so it's active. Just click once on here. Hold down your Alt or Option key. Click and drag the mask. Copied. It's so easy. It took me a while to figure that particular method out. I think somebody else actually told me about that because I was doing it another way that was a little more complicated. But it's so easy. And then say in this one, I wanted to mask it opposite. I wanted the effect on the background and not on the deer. Could do Control I or Command I, and that will invert the mask. So now everything is, the background, whatever I did on this layer would be showing on the background and partly on the bottom and not on the deer. So there you go. So the erasing revealing image under a texture layer using a white or a black brush. Black is hiding what's on this layer. So if this were my texture, and I masked black, that's hiding that texture. So then you would see what's below it. So you could think of the black as like kind of putting a hole in the piece of paper, and whatever's on this piece of paper is going to be hidden when you're painting with black. So if I go back to the black and white one, so by painting with black, it's letting us see that layer underneath. It's hiding this effect. Whatever's on this layer is being hidden by the black. Okay. Let's see. Someone smarter than me said to help remember how to do the merged layer to punch all the buttons lower left of the keyboard except Control and Caps Lock. Yes, it's actually, the procedure is called the claw because you need several fingers. But the way I remember it, and I'm on a PC because it's the Control Alt Shift E. If you remember the word case, C-A-S-E, Control Alt Shift E. So on a Mac, that would be, it'd be C-O-S-E, Command Option Shift E. So that's how I remember it anyway on my PC. I have a photo of a bird on a branch and the background is a gray day, so it's not quite white. If I wanted to turn the background a true white, what's the best way to do that? I would make a selection of that sky, which if it's a consistent color, you should be able to do fairly easily with even the Magic Wand tool. The Magic Wand looks for consistency in color, so you can see here it varies, but you can hold the Alt key and keep selecting, okay? And then once you have a selection like that and you want to fill it with white, just make your foreground color white. And if you did Alt backspace or Option backspace on a Mac, oops, can't be on the mask though, you got to be on the actual picture. Let's hide that. So if I did an Alt backspace, it's going to fill that selection with the color. So if you really wanted it to be pure white, select the background. Now, sometimes it's easier to make the selection of the subject. So if you did that, if we went back and selected the subject first, but I really want the background selected, go to Select Inverse. So now my background is selected, and I could do Alt backspace, and it would fill that background with white. So whatever part of the background you want white, if it's just the sky, then I would select the sky. But sometimes it's easier to do that. So the last thing I want to show you, let's close this one. I wanted to talk about cropping and sizing for printing, because that was another question that I had. So when you're in the crop tool, as you saw when I started, I had some numbers in there. So this particular image, first you want to look at the size of your image. And right now this is like 13 and a half, say, by almost 9. That's not going to work. If I wanted to print this on a, say, a 16 by 20 canvas, I do a lot of canvas prints, and I'll talk about that in a second. And the size, one of the standard sizes is 16 by 20. If I made this top size 20, you see that my width is going to be very short. So if I made this 16, I'm going to have to crop over 4 inches from my shape, right? And I'll show you that with the crop tool. So if we have the crop tool and our width is going to be 20 and our height is 16, that's how I would have to crop this, and I'd be cutting off part of the deer. So that's one of the reasons I tell my real beginner students is I usually tell people don't crop initially. If you think you're going to want to print something, you can always crop it later on. The only time I like to crop ahead of time, when I'm working with textures, especially if I've got something that's kind of got a border to it, I'm going to want to have my image be my final size, so I'm not later on cropping off part of that texture. So that's something to think about, you know, when you're first starting on an image. Most images, I know, like out of my Canon camera, the proportion is basically a 4:6 proportion. It's a 2:3 ratio. So then when you want to go like this to a 16 by 20, which is not that same proportion, that's when you run into, you know, problems with the cropping. What I have done for some of my canvases is to add basically a mat around the edge of it. So it looks like it's, even though it's printed on canvas, that it's got like a mat board effect to give it a border so that I didn't have to crop something, which has happened with, you see if I can find one of those for you. We're almost at 5, but just give me a couple minutes and I'll finish up. Hold on, Viv. Yep, hold on. No, that's what I'm going to talk about on Thursday. I don't have it all in front of me right now. On my desktop, I'm looking at my other screen, so give me 1 second. I've got prints to order. Let's see if I've got one in here. So these were some that I've printed. Of course, none of these have a border. But say this one, I actually, this image I just did for somebody we met who let us photograph inside this mill. This was an old mill, and I wanted to do a canvas for them. And because I didn't want to crop anything, and I did photograph it this tight, I didn't really have any room for that. So I made a 12 by 18 canvas, which is that same proportion as a 4:6. You know, 3 times 3, you know, times 3 would make it a 12 by 18. So I printed it in that shape, so I didn't have to crop anything. Sandy, Thursday is, I'm going to do something in the blog about Luminar. It's not an event, so nothing to have on your calendar. So yes, I'm going to talk about canvas prints right now. So where I like to print things, and also if I'm enlarging something, if I have this one and I size this to 12 by 18, now I decide I want to do something double that size. That's when I use the Topaz Gigapixel AI. That will let you enlarge anything up to 600% in one shot. And it does a great job. You don't get any pixelation. It actually makes the images look better, I think, sometimes than the original, because it will add some sharpening where needed and detail and make a really nice copy for you. So I use that a lot. I also use that when I create textures like by hand or something, and they're on maybe a 5 by 7 piece of paper. I'll scan them, and then I use that to enlarge them to like the 15 by 10 or 15 by 15 that I sell them at. So that is another way that I use Gigapixel a lot. So for printing, if I'm doing small prints like 4 by 6s, I'm maybe using them to make cards or something. A lot of times I use Shutterfly. They do a great job. Color-wise, their pricing is great. And if you do a lot of 4 by 6s, they have like, you can buy bundles and get them for like, I don't know, 8 or 9 cents a piece, I think. 8 by 10s and that kind of size that I've been doing lately. I don't do that many, but sometimes I do them as gifts for some of our property owners. I actually get them done at our local Walgreens. I didn't like the ones in Connecticut. I didn't think their colors were really good, but the one here has been really good. So I have been using them. If I'm doing large prints, I use a company online. I'll type it in the box here. It's called Vivix, VIVYX.com. And they have really good pricing, and I've had great luck with them. I haven't had any issues with color and stuff. And I did a bunch, gosh, probably 15 years ago now or so, almost, when I was working at the mortgage company. When one of my bosses left, the other boss is like, I think you need to decorate the office, and let's get rid of these like motivational posters they had up. And I ended up doing 21 16 by 20s. So I also didn't want to mat all of those, so I just matted in Photoshop and then printed a 16 by 20 print and put them in the frame, and they looked great. And then Canvas, I use Canvas on demand. I think they're fabulous. I've probably done 50 canvases with them, and they always have sales. So you can usually get a 16 by 20 anywhere from $20 to $24. And if you order several things at a time, you'll save on shipping as well. I think I have that on my YouTube channel. I'm pretty sure. I will check. If not, I'll do something on that, because it takes some time. I don't have time for that right now, but Matt, and I'm making myself a note so I don't forget. I think I might have done something on that though. And yes, a stamped layer is the same as a merged layer, Helen. Somebody asked on that. So it's called either or. And then other sources for printing I haven't used, but I know they're highly recommended, is MPix, MPIX, and Nations Photo Lab, and they do lots and lots of printing. Both of those companies have very good reputations. Phew, we covered a lot today. Is Shutterfly logo on the back of the note cards? Yes, it is. If you print cards, it's not on the back of prints, but it is on the back of cards. So if you do print cards and you want to sell them, I wouldn't use Shutterfly. What I do for cards is I buy the blank card layouts from Photographer's Edge. And that's when I do my 4 by 6 prints that go inside of them. And I spelled that wrong. It's Photographer's Edge. And that's how I do my note cards. So let's see. Yeah, so don't forget to grab your copy of the notes if you didn't get them yet. And all the images are in there, so you can always, work along with me when you watch the replay. And that will be up by tomorrow. And I think that will do it. So let me throw this up. Don't forget our next conference. I've been posting that in the blog. I'm almost done with our speakers. I'm waiting for one person to get back from a workshop this week, so hopefully by next week I'll have everybody pinned down. Pretty close to being done with that. And there you go. Stephanie says heading to Photoshop to practice. There you go. Yeah, I think things like this are always a good review, even if you know Photoshop pretty well. It's I know I always learn things from other people. That's why I like to post a lot of those tutorials and things like today in the around the web blog. There's some cool articles in there that I've got a few still open in my tabs that I want to look at later. Thanks, everybody. I do appreciate your being here, and I will talk to you soon.